Hi, I'm Terrell Strayhorn, Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Virginia Union University. So delighted that you've taken the time to check out this Fireside chat. I've had the opportunity to chat with or speak with Dr. W. Franklyn Richardson, who is the pastor of Grace Baptist Church. He's also the chairman of the Board of Trustees here at Virginia Union University. Many will know him. He's a civil rights leader, a foremost authority in the theology and spiritual world. But this afternoon, I've had the opportunity to sit down and talk with him about his latest book, Witness to Grace. And here's what he had to say. It's such an honor to sit down with you, Dr. Richardson, and have this time to talk about your latest book and all of the exploits you've engaged in your life. But just to get us started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, that's really what the book leads to. I mean, I have been a pastor now for over 51 years and have been blessed with extraordinary experience and opportunity. And as I was reflecting on it right after a bout of surgery, I thought it was important that I would put down an account of my journey and explain what I saw happen to me through the prism of God's grace. And so I began to, I really wrote the book with my thumb on my iPhone. And so all the manuscripts are in my cell phone. But I'd be on the back of a plane or in the back of a car on the plane, middle of the night, just anywhere I was, and thoughts would come and I'd do it. And I had an assistant at my office who I would send them to, and then they would go on to the publisher. But it was remarkable. And when I think about my journey, I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I was born to parents who were very providing, protecting people of faith. And I guess my earliest understandings about faith were the escort that my mother gave me through her relationship with the Lord, as well as my father, who had a more stronger presence, where my mother was more cuddly, and the first prism of faith came through that cuddling capture of my mother. So I had a brother and a sister, but there's some real instances in my journey which point to how the grace of God operated in my life. And those are the things that I really want to highlight. I really didn't want to, in the book, I just felt it necessary to set the stage to talk about my early times and how I got to the place of faith sensitivity. But the things that drove the book were the instances where I wanted to highlight where God had been so operative in my life. And that, grace, I always say that grace is, while faith is when you look forward and anticipation where you're going, you need faith to get there. And while grace is reflection, look back over your shoulder and see where you've been. And it is in the looking back over our shoulders that we see the grace of God operative in our lives. And so that's what I did in this book.
So you're the senior pastor of Grace Baptist Church. And you decided to name your latest book, Witness to Grace. So talk with us about that. What is grace to you, and where have you seen it in your life?
Well, let me say this, that when I talk about grace, while I am inclusive of the theological notion, I'm really talking about something much bigger than the theology. I'm talking about not just your salvific in terms of salvation, but in terms of the practicalities of living out our lives. There are things that we accomplish, things that we have opportunities to do and experience that have very little to do with us. And it is in those instances that I have seen the presence of God's grace, His doing for me in spite of me, not just my salvation, but the practical living of my life, right? So grace is a bigger thing. Grace is you can see the grace of God in the midst of your journey, and you really can see God, see the grace of God, or see life through the prism of grace, even if you are not a person of faith. Grace functions even if you have not owned the salvation that is available through the grace of God. So for me, I have, as I review and reflected, and always reflecting my whole journey of how God is. Well, let's use a perfect example of what I mean. I went to West Philadelphia High School. I graduated. The counselor said to me, Mr. Dribbin, I'll never forget his name, that I wasn't college material. And I was really insulted by that because at the time I was also working in a hospital, and the doctors there had agreed that if I would graduate from college, they would pay for my medical school. And well, when I went to share with my counselor, that's when he told me I wasn't college material, and I wanted to ignore him, and I did. And I went into West Philadelphia Community College, where I flunked out. And then when I accepted my call to ministry, my pastor recommended me to go to Virginia Union, and I told him that I had flunked out of community college, and I don't know if I could get into college. And so he said, well, no, he said, you go to Virginia Union. It's one of the best schools for black preachers. You go there. And so for me, I guess that's the first, one of the early beginnings of God's grace made available, but one can really see it amplified when you consider what happened after going there, right? So I go to Virginia Union. They give me a conditional matriculation because I did not have reading capabilities. I couldn't read. I've been socially promoted through the schools of Philadelphia and arrived unable to read. They put me in a remediation for a year. They said, now if you make it through this remediation, we'll let you stay here. And so I did. I graduated, went on to Yale and pastored churches and Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, traveled all over the world. Served as a pastor at 19 years old in Richmond. So all that was a marvelous journey, right? And 35 years later, I was elected chairman of the trustee board. The student who had a conditional matriculation now signs every degree of the students who graduate. That is grace. Another instance is when I was, for 13 years, and during this period, I also was the general secretary of the National Baptist Convention. And so I was the youngest general secretary of the National Baptist Convention. At that time, we had about 30,000 churches, and I was the chief operating officer for the denomination. I did ecumenical work. I was on the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches and all that at 32. To understand how much grace that is to understand that everybody in the leadership of the denomination was over 60. All right, so I'm 32, and I'm in the second most important office of the denomination, and did that for 13 years. And when you hear me talk about Yale, it's like saying that you just went to, next thing you left Virginia, you went to Yale. No, I had got interrupted at Yale, went in, did this thing as a general secretary without my master's divinity degree, without my degree. And then the the convention put me everywhere, so I wasn't able to finish. But about halfway through the 13 years, I went back to Yale and finished. So it's been my journey has not been in sequence. It's been interruptions along the way, and those interruptions have been the gaze of grace. And so the fact that I've ended where I am has been God's grace. The final illustration I get, there are many in the book, is I ran for president after being general secretary. I ran for president of the denomination, National Baptist Convention. Had a huge campaign and had a wonderful support of most of the denomination. And this is the opening chapter really, but when I was running for the convention, I lost the election because of malpractice. The person I ran against the night before went in and sabotaged the voting machines, and it was just shameful. He ended up going to jail for his manipulations and dishonesty of the convention, Henry Lyons. So I lost, real difficult for me, because I really prayed and asked the Lord when I was running, if this ain't what you want me to do, I'm fine. I'm happy being, but from all indications, I felt that the Lord wanted me to do it, and I worked very hard, and everybody had, and I lost like by 24 votes or something like that, and everybody knew I was going to win. I mean, it was just kind of, but it didn't happen. I went back again, and similar kind of things happened. So I was kind of burdened with that for a little while. But God's grace would have it. I'm today the chairman of the Conference of National Black Churches, which is all 9 denominations. One of my friends, Bishop John Bryant, said to me when I was of the AME Church, he's the senior bishop in the church at that time, he said to me, he said, Rich, they didn't want you as president of the convention, but now you're the president of all of us. So there is that grace constantly showing up in my life. And I talk about my experiences, my world travel, my opportunities to help people, go to Ethiopia and feed the hungry. Just a wonderful journey. But I guess it's important that I'm not just telling a story. I'm telling it through the prism of God's grace. You know, it's for hopefully to get other people to see the grace of God operative in their lives. When we see the grace of God operative in our lives, we become grateful. We're grateful, and when you're grateful, you're optimistic, and you're positive. And so if people can see, even though life may not be everything that they wanted it to be, if they can see that there have been places in their lives where they got more than they deserved, or they got more than they worked for, or that without the blessings of God, and they come not in big things, but in small things as well. The sunshine in the morning, right. A bird singing, sitting along the ocean. All of these are expressions of God's grace. So that's how I walk through the book, and then I come to the instances in my life, personal things that took place by surgery and so forth and so on. And I come to the epilogue of the book as a result of the pandemic. We were scheduled to go release the book in April, but we were in the heart of the pandemic. We couldn't do nothing. The book publishers were closed, printers were closed, shippers were closed. So we couldn't really get the book released. And so they told me it would be like maybe September. And so that gave me opportunity to reassess this notion of grace. And so there are 2 segments, not very long, in the book. One is seeing the grace of God through the pandemic. And I talk about the pandemic as the possibility of God's reset on the creation, or did God deposit in our DNA some kind of prefixed notion that when the corruption levels of our humanity became so bad, they would kick in and cause a whole collapse and take away the fake walls that separate us, like race and nationality and class. The pandemic has a way of reducing us all to our common denominator. And then the second part I talked about was the whole, as I was writing, they emerged the Black Lives Matter notion. And so I wrote about that as well. So I conclude the book with the grace of God seen in the midst of the pandemic, and the grace of God unfolding in Black Lives Matter. And we have seen that in Black Lives Matter, maybe the glimpses of a turning point in race consciousness, in ownership of racism by segments of the population that did not formerly own it, or ignored it, or did not realize the experiences, the fallout of racism in current society. And so the book became had that kind of energy, and that's what I tried to do in it.
That's such a rich story. And it's inspirational. It's a real life story. I mean, your vulnerability, talking about going from conditional admit to chairman of the board. What advice or words do you have for those who are going to watch this episode that might be inspirational for them too?
Well, I think what we, sometimes we think about purpose as a big picture. My purpose has to do, no, my purpose begins in this moment. As I move from this moment, extracting everything I can out of the current moment. And my purpose will unfold as I exploit the possibilities of the moment. So that my purpose is unfolding. I mean, I may be centrally at a certain place in my life, but I can't see everything that life will present me, because it will not all be good and it will not be all bad. There'll be mountains and valleys, dark places and bright places, but life will be an unfolding journey, and nobody can prescribe. All he can do is prepare. And when preparation meets opportunity, then the grace of God is made manifest. You prepare all you can, God sends the opportunity. It's unfortunate when God sends the opportunity, you have not prepared. So you must do all you can to prepare for whatever. Do your maximum preparation. And let me say this, preparation ought not be seen as something I'm going to be complete, because in the process of preparation, you may fail. You may be disappointed. You may not have exhausted all that you could have exhausted, but don't be carrying any guilt about that, because where you are in the moment may not let you act as effectively as you might look back and say, oh, I should have done better than that. Because you got to reflect on the context that you were in and what was happening inside of you and around you that made that preparation possible. So we just live in that kind of, so I believe the purpose begins in the moment, and we discover our purpose as we walk forward and as we prepare for whatever comes.
Any comments about the state of racial affairs in the country, where you think we're going and headed?
Well, I was interviewed last week, about the election. And I said that America disappointed me, because the consciousness and rhetoric born of the Black Lives Movement and the embrace that seemed to be capturing the culture was not really manifested in the results of the election. While I personally am grateful that Biden is president, I'm discouraged that so many people would vote to reinforce the status quo, to lock us in this place of paralysis regards to the pandemic, to lock us in this place of economic collapse, to lock us in the place of rising racism and white supremacy, that people would vote to keep things as they are. And there was no question, because there was nothing in the message of the president, the current president. There was nothing in the message that said he's going to change, he's going to go in a different direction. You knew exactly what he was going to do. And you tell me that 70 million people in America affirmed what he stood for, what he said, what he did, his lack of performance. That's very disappointing. And so I think that is one of the things that I look at in light of the Black Lives Matter. However, I have been encouraged by corporate entities who have stepped up and made resources available to institutions like Virginia Union. I just got a note today where one of our board trustee members in Dominion has given us $6 million today. So there are corporations on, and we have a great pool of corporations stepping up and wanting to affirm their affirmation of African American experience. And because when you think about it, Virginia Union, 155 years old, the very fact that we survived without adequate support on the dimes, nickels, and quarters of our forebearers who kept these institutions level, together, sustained us. And at the end of the day, which was 2020, we're still standing But all along the 152 years, we were treated like second-class citizens, a second-class institution, because of the people we served were considered second-class people. So all of the resources for education, predominantly in the society, went to white institutions. So you take a comparison of Virginia Union and the private institutions in Richmond, the private colleges in Virginia. The white private colleges have abundance of resources, billions in endowments, and we're struggling to get $40 million in the endowment. And that's been struggle and strain. And so it's time for those people of goodwill to step up and say, look, let's reform our behavior, let's repent. Repentance doesn't have to be confession. It can be changing action. It can be corrective measures to fix what is broken. And so I think that's where we are in this whole moment of Black Lives Matter. We've also, but at the same time, the election gave us a great, it's a paradox, a great inspiration that we have lived in the era where a black man became president of the United States, served remarkably for 2 terms without any blemishes, and now a black woman is the first woman to be vice president of the United States. So there are expressions, glimpses of grace, reason for optimism. So it's a kind of mixed bag. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm laughing, I'm crying, but that's where it is.
You have an impressive biography. Yeah. Senior pastor of a church, author of a new book, chairman of the board of trustees, and I've got to tell you, as the provost and senior vice president, one role that you play that has a huge impact on our institution is chairman of the board. So we've got historically black colleges, 100 of them in the country, educating 300,000. Just a word or two about the importance and the significance of historically black colleges today.
Well, that's one of my greatest joys, to be aligned in this moment in my life to return back what I received from Virginia Union. Without Virginia Union, my story would not exist. There would be another story, and it would not be anything like the story that we are talking about today. So what we've had to struggle to do is to get the larger society to understand that these institutions, historically black institutions, are still very important to the reparation, to the restoration of African Americans. And that has something to do with their history and their focus. We are not out of the struggle. We're not away from the consequences of racism. And unfortunately, my experience has been that sometimes the most well-meaning white brothers and sisters don't realize that they are captured by their supremacy, and they downgrade the value of the white institutions, of black institutions. They dismiss them. They even help raise money for them, but they don't believe they're efficient. But what we know is that we graduate more blacks than white institutions, because we have a mission to make up for the lost time that racism has caused us and the struggle it has imposed upon us. And I'm so happy to say that African American HBCUs are rising. They're rising. And they're rising because we have competent faculty who have taken seriously their education and who want to make a contribution to the struggle of the restoration of African American people. It's vital that we have these institutions, because the masses of black people will not have access, even today, to white institutions. And if they get in white institutions, a good percentage of them will never graduate from those institutions. At Virginia Union, we don't only admit you, we want to graduate you, because that's a validation for who we are. And also, we know where the students are. The students are us. And that gives that doesn't mean that you can't get a good education in a white school. It doesn't mean that you can't, but it's likely what most black people need. I have grandchildren. What they need, and my grandchildren have had the privilege of going to white schools, in, secondary and elementary and so forth. What they need when they graduate from them is reinforcement to face the racist realities that they're going to have when they live out their lives and work in corporate America. They need to go to my children have to go to black schools so that they can be anchored to participate in the society. And I tell that to all black parents. You don't just need to go to Virginia Union or HBCUs for academics. You need your children to go there for self-esteem, because the affliction that racist America will put on your child will retard their success if they don't get some place to reinforce. You don't have to just get it in HBCUs. You can get it in churches. Raise your children in churches. But you got to go. They need the taste of institutions that are reinforce them. When I came to Virginia Union, the first time I ever saw a black teacher, and I grew up in the inner city of Philadelphia. The first time I saw a black lawyer or a black doctor, when I came to Virginia Union in 1967. First time I saw black middle class. It's the first time I saw black people in charge when I walked on this campus. Black people were in charge. What that does to your self-esteem? One of the great illustrations of that is the first time I went to Ghana, when I got off the plane. And it was like I didn't realize the toxicity that I was carrying with me living in America until I looked up and saw everybody in this country was black. I didn't have to prove myself no more. The president was black. It was a reinforcement. And white people take that for granted, which is fine. They take it for granted because that's the way it is. But if you are a black person in America, you're always having to prove yourself outside of these cocoons of reinforcement. But at Virginia Union, you are assumed, or at HBCs, you are assumed to have value. You don't have to prove your value. We affirm your value, the fact that you walked in the institution. And that's what the value of HBCUs are. And there'll be a long time before we don't need them.
That's right. So you're a pastor of this large church, and then the pandemic hits. And many churches were devastated by the pandemic and have closed or had to find an alternative means, but not for Grace Baptist Church. You've actually thrived or grown. So talk to us about your experience leading a church through the pandemic.
Well, we came through the pandemic on March the 15th. We decided that we weren't going to come back to church anymore. And we were already doing streaming, but we really weren't paying that much attention to it. And so that first Sunday, we decided that we were going to stream. And fortunately, how God works it, there's a woman on our staff who had been training as a videographer. And at time she had graduated just as the pandemic. She was already as a graphic designer, but she had the competency to take over the development of what we are today. Today we are a studio. We have a full studio at the church, and we are on Impact TV. I used to see 2,500 people on Sunday morning in the 3 services. Now I see 15,000, 20,000 people see me on virtual, right? And then everything in the churches, there's 1 or 2 Zoom things are going on every day in the church. I start on Sunday morning at 8 o'clock with what they call the pastor's moment. 200 or 300 people come on Zoom so they could talk to each other and see each other. And when I finish giving them an update of what's going on in my life and what's happening in the church, they stay for another 15 minutes talking to each other and seeing each other. So the fellowship is great. Then we go to Sunday school at 9:30 and the men's ministry, Sunday school at 10. Then we have the youth churches at 10. And then we go to regular worship which is wonderful. I mean, the music, minister of music, he's been with me for 30 years, and the music is just phenomenal. And then we go to children's church and youth church, which are two great things. But one of the great things about it is we divided our church into 80 sheepfolds, and so the deacons put their hands around the members. So my deacons, I charged them from the first time we were out of the church that they had to make contact with their people twice a month. They had to call their families twice a month. Yeah. So we keep the connectedness. The connectedness was very important. So they would call, and guess what? Another thing that's happened. I never went to deacons meetings. You know, I trained them. I'd have workshops once a week. But during the pandemic, I ended up going every week. I'll have a Zoom call every week, and that built the relationship, and it made them more accountable, and the church. So we didn't lose any members. As a matter of fact, we had 50 members join 4 months of the pandemic. Right, and but we didn't just become a virtual church. We were committed to being a servant church still. So just so happens that we had purchased a building next door to the church. No, for any reason. We purchased it because it was foreclosed on, and we were concerned about who would move next to us church. It cost us $400,000, but we bought it and would figure out what we'd do with it later. Well, when the pandemic came, it's a big garage, and we turned it into a storage and distribution center for homeless people. So we serve 500 homeless families every week, full groceries for 500 people. One guy in California who was a Jewish fellow who I met heard that I was doing it. His family has owned Idaho potatoes for generations. Every potato that goes to New York comes from their farms. And so he gives me 500 5-pound bags of potatoes every week that we distribute to, along with all the other groceries that we do. We do 50 tons a week of food to people. We provided computers for devices for young people through our Community Development Corporation. We still minister to the sick and the shut-in to the degree we can. But the shut-in are the seniors who can't get out in the difficult in this pandemic. So we deliver the groceries to them. So we launched a partnership with the legal system, the courts. We created. I invited 4 other churches to join in, and we have put pilot court places in the churches across the county, so that so people can take care of their court business without going to court. And we have computers set up and operational stuff that we've had screened by the courts, and the courts provide a lawyer who's available to do through computer. So our whole idea is that we cannot just be a virtual witness. We have to be a servant church, helping to transform and speak out about injustices and do the things that we ought to be doing. I'm not going to settle to be just a television personality.
Will you ever go back, do you think?
Yeah, you mean go back to what? We'll never go back to just in person. Okay. What we're planning to do now, we are starting construction, taking advantage of the season. We are going to put in a huge LED screen for the front. We're going to put in Zoom cameras, not Zoom, but the ones that fly through the air.
Okay.
You know what I'm talking about.
I do.
Yeah. We're going to do that, and we're going to set up so that we can do both.
Okay.
So we're going to keep our television commitment. We're going to keep our streaming and our thing, but we're going to do it live from the sanctuary and still developing and today I have members in France, in the United Kingdom, in Africa, in Japan, as a result of virtual.
How do you do it all? How do you manage everything that you're doing?
I really don't know. But let me say this. The challenge of the church going forward is adopting to the new technology. It won't be optional. Understand that our children now are being trained how to be educated virtually. And that's not going to go away. And the church is going to have to align itself with where those children are, because they're the generation we're going to serve going forward. So if the church is going to be relevant, it's got to speak in the language and the nuance that the children, the teenagers now function. Otherwise, we will wade into irrelevance. So we have no choice we'll never go back to being what we were. As what happened, we were always on our way to this. The pandemic just accelerated us getting there. We're always on our way to this. It's not like we got something that was in, we just got accelerated.
What's next for Dr. W. Franklyn Richardson?
Well, I think I'm really trying to, one of the things I'd say is that the things that I do all feed one another. So it's not like I'm ever over here, over there. I'm on the board of a couple corporations, but even there, they feed the different things. They feed Virginia Union. They feed National Action Network, where I serve as chairman of the board with Reverend Sharpton. Virginia Union feeds that, or the Conference of National Black. So all of it kind of feeds everything. So I guess I'm moving towards purpose fulfilled. You know what I mean? It's a good thing that you get to that place where you get to a place where purpose is fulfilled. I think I'm on my way to purpose fulfilled.
Wow. I hope you enjoyed this time with Dr. W. Franklyn Richardson talking about his new book, Witness to Grace, a story that's riveting, it's personal, it's vulnerable, but most importantly, it's educational, inspirational, motivational, and hopefully will propel you personally, to secure the promise of a limitless future. I'm Terrell Strayhorn, Provost and Senior Vice President here at Virginia Union University, and appreciate you taking time to join us for this episode. Take care, listen, stay 6 feet apart, wear your mask, wash your hand, take good care of yourself for all of us.